RJ O'Connell, co-host of the Motorsport 101 podcast alongside Dre Harrison and Cam Buckley. Thank you for listening. As you might be able to tell just from the way this is starting, the podcast you're about to listen to will be different from what you're used to hearing on Motorsport 101. This is our loving parody of the Engineering Disasters podcast, Well, There's Your Problem, creatively entitled, Well, There's Your Caution. And it covers the original Fuji Speedway as it was constructed from 1966 to 1973. This was meant to be our April Fool's episode, but it's obviously out much later. We still wanted to follow through with what we thought was a pretty good idea at the time, because our retrospective of Ontario Motor Speedway that's on YouTube, you could still go out there and watch it, seemed to get a lot of positive feedback and attention. And, we wanted to see if we could try to do something like that again, covering a historic topic like this. Now, as a general content warning, we will be discussing a number of fatal racing accidents in this podcast, which is something that's unavoidable when dealing with a topic like this one. Though we will try our best to kind of... It's tough because the podcast it's based on is very much like dark comedy in a sense, but knowing that we're all motorsport people, we also want to try and be as respectful as possible to the subject matter as we can. Also, to Justin, Liam, November, and Roz, this is something that we put together out of love. We all love your work here on Motorsport 101, and we'd like to think you're doing some good in the world through this podcast. Hopefully, teaching lessons that hopefully won't be repeated further on down the line. Or not. Who knows? Anyway, on with the show. Hi, welcome to Well, There's Your Caution, our long-running Motorsport Engineering Disasters podcast. Let us first introduce ourselves. I'm RJ O'Connell. I'm the person that's speaking right now. My pronouns are he and him. They can also be they and them if you're feeling spicy, provocative, or if you just don't want to assume.
I'm Dre Harrison. My pronouns are he and him. I'm the person that's speaking to you right now. In my day job, I am a production coordinator for the Motorsport Network. I just like to be a podcaster on the side.
And I am Cameron Buckley. My pronouns are he and him, in case you have amnesia and you forgot that I'm him. During the day, I sell fruit to the masses. And
excellent.
Otherwise, I like to talk about racing technology, and racing accessories.
Oh, fantastic. Well, you're in for a treat, as you always are if you've been listening to our many, many episodes on the subject. But first, Dre, I'm going to ask you something.
Sure.
So I've got an image up here. What do you see in front of you?
I see race cars, a lot of giant rear wings, and I see seemingly a banked sort of racing layout.
Yeah, that's what we'll go with. It's a little bit odd shape, but you do see race cars from the 1960s. This is the 1969 JF Grand Prix held at the relatively brand new Fuji Speedway. Oh, we've been wanting to do this for a long time, ever since we launched this podcast. God knows how long ago it's been. We've done so many of these, but yes, we're here to talk about old Fuji Speedway, how it came to be, and ultimately how it came to not be. But first, as we always want to do on the show, it's time for the gosh dang news. I wanted to lead off with this one here. This comes from the High Limit Racing Series at Riverside Speedway. Not Riverside, California, but Riverside, Arkansas. There's a driver by the name of Brian Bell who's running the preliminaries of this High Limit Racing sprint car event. And I'm gonna send you the video for this because he has a crash. And the consequences of it, well, they don't look too good. Now, I will say up front that Brian Bell was able to walk away from the crash, but he's very lucky that he
Good.
did, because he slides up through the catch fence, and when I say through the catch fence, I mean through it. His car clips an adjacent telephone pole, which is right around here, and then comes to rest. And then comes to rest right beside all of this heavy machinery. We got a tractor. We got some trucks here. What looks like a water truck.
Yeah, that is. I've just watched the clip now from Flow Racing's Twitter account, so credit to them. But my man it's like a Beyblade that's come out of a stadium if you bought one as a kid. It is insane. Somehow he walked away from that one. That is crazy.
Now, RJ, when you describe catch fencing, I look at this catch fencing and I think, isn't this the same stuff that we really weren't down with when Pocono was putting up effectively chicken wire?
Oh no, Cam, I'm glad to tell you that it's even worse and less effective.
Ah, exactly what you want.
It looks like the chicken fence that was there at Pocono back in the day.
It's worse.
Yeah, it's worse than that. I don't know what this is stopping. I don't even know if I would throw a baseball up against this, would it just rip through it or would it bounce back? We don't know.
I could put you through it.
You know, you always want to put me through. Why not just put me through barbed wire and light tubes like they always do in Pennsylvania?
It's a regular thing.
Well, what's interesting about this is that, yeah, Bell got lucky hitting the telephone pole.
In a sense, yeah. I mean, of all the things you'd want to hit after being launched through a catch fence, something that stops you immediately might actually help you out in this instance.
Yeah, because if it didn't hit that telephone pole, there's a good chance he flies right into, I want to say, this tractor over off to the left, maybe this water truck. And
I'm thinking the water truck.
Yeah,
that looks something straight out of Burnout 3, and I don't mean that in a good way.
No, you really don't want to be trying to do Burnout Paradise combos at a sprint car event.
You never want to be the marked man in real life.
No, not recommended.
No. And of course, this is from the High Limit Racing Series, co-founded by Brad Sweet and what's the word I'm looking here? Renounced racist Kyle Larson. They want to do that. They want to do this. They want to do this because they want the prize money to be better and they want to raise the standards of everything. And I get that, but I almost feel like, you know, unless this Riverside Speedway in Arkansas makes changes, I don't know if this is fit for purpose. I mean, he did clear the catch fence.
He did. He cleared the catch fence that you're not supposed to clear.
It's
generally that's bad.
What catch fence?
What did
it feels catch? Like it's in the name. It feels like it's on the label that it's supposed to catch you. And in this case, it went through it like tissue paper.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, what a day. What a day of racing. Again, thankfully, nobody seriously hurt out of all this. But shout out to Brian Bell, who learned what it was like to be a Major League Baseball, being hit over the fence for a home run.
Showtime.
Okay, now this... Oh, golly. You know, I was having a peaceful morning. I was waking up next to my partner, right? We're going to sleep in the whole night. And then I make the mistake of looking at my phone. And then I see this.
It's a common one.
IndyCar announced penalties for Team Pensky, including disqualifications for the number 3 of Scott McLaughlin and the number 2 of Joseph Newgarden, and a 10-point penalty for number 12 of Will Power from the Firestone Grand Prix of St. Petersburg, presented by RP Funding, on Sunday, March 10th, on the streets of St. Petersburg. Team Pensky was in violation of the following push-to-pass parameters. Rule 14.19.15, an indicator to enable push-to-pass will be sent via CAN communication from the timing and scoring beacon on board the car to the team data logger. The signal must be passed in the ECU unmodified and uninterrupted during all road and street course events. And Rule 14.19.16, race starts and any race restart that occurs before the lap prior to the white flag or prior to 3 minutes remaining of a timed race event will have the push-to-pass system disabled and will be enabled for a given car once that car, capital C car, reaches the alternate start-finish line. According to the rulebook, the violation is considered a race procedure penalty. That's under 922, which includes the right to reposition the driver car over the posting results with a disqualification, 922 sits. That includes the forfeiture of points and awards. During the Sunday, April 21st warm-up session ahead of the Acura Grand Prix of Long Beach, IndyCar discovered the team's possible rules violation. An extensive review of data from this race on the streets of St. Petersburg revealed the team Pensky manipulated the overtake system so that the number 2, 3, and 12 cars had the ability to use push-to-pass on starts and restarts. According to the IndyCar rulebook, use of overtake is not available during championship races until the car reaches the alternate start-finish line. It was determined that the number 2 and number 3 gained a competitive advantage by using push-to-pass on restarts, while the number 12 did not. Additionally, all free entries have been fined $25,000 or... Cam, how much are PS5s going for these days?
If you're looking at a disk drive, let's say a slim one, because the PS5 Pros haven't been announced yet, $499.
Okay, so let's say...
And I live in New Hampshire, so, no sales tax.
Wow, so that's about 50 PlayStation 5s.
Oh, yeah.
We're looking at that
the maths on that one's actually quite easy for once.
50 PS5s, that just makes them a scalper at the end of 2020.
Yeah, very much so. This is not good.
You know what makes it worse? If you've read on racer.com,
credit to Marshall Pruitt, by the way.
Credit to Marshall Pruitt, always on the job for IndyCar and American sports car racing. Racer also understands that at least one team raised its concern regarding Penske drivers illegally using push-to-pass in 2023, and went as far as sending the series onboard video clips of what it considered irregular button use for IndyCar to review.
I was having a great start to the season. I really was. I love that Pato won a race, but not like this, man.
Pato award, because as we know, has now been awarded the win as a result of those 2 disqualifications. Not only his first, but McLaren's first win in IndyCar since Iowa 2022. Ironically, also a race where Joseph Newgarden's car didn't quite work properly. Who would have thought?
His suspension broke and he crashed when he was going to sweep the weekend.
Look, this is... As Chip Ganassi said in his quite scathing comment about this earlier this afternoon, this is a horrible, horrible look for everyone involved.
How is it a horrible look? I mean, the guy who owns the series was willing to penalize his own cars.
The guy who owns the series was also having his cars cheat.
Yeah.
And if you believe this, it would certainly need to have more evidence on this, because I am damn sure that this is not the last we'll hear of it. This has been going on for a little bit. Anyone want to engage the Toyota 1995 button?
What I would say to this is that IndyCar, and Marshall Pruitt used this exact phrase in the piece written about this on Racer.com earlier. And I've said this before. You assume with motorsport that everything is conducted in the premise of good faith. Because it's a good one. You can laugh at me, but that's generally meant to be the idea. And Marshall said in the post, and I agree with him, you can't possibly do that with IndyCar ever again. Yes, I'm glad that Jay Fry looked at his boss's team and threw the book at them regardless of status. That is a good thing. But what I will say is that whole idea of good faith is doing a lot of heavy lifting when we have proof that Joseph Newgarden and Scott McLaughlin were pushing their push-to-pass button, even though they know in the rulebook you cannot use push-to-pass immediately after a restart. In a race, which I remind you, Scott McLaughlin gained 5 positions during the Grand Prix of St. Pete this year, purely off the first lap of restarts. It is a horrible look.
Well, I mean, it's not all bad for IndyCar. I mean, just look at how the ratings were for.
I
Oh,
almost, my bitter Joseph Newgarden fan in me says, you know what? They discovered this penalty, they discovered this infraction, and the racing god said, "This is karma. You're drawing a .3, and you're getting outworked by golfing. Not even good golfing."
It's and that's the most concerning thing about all this to me is that not even the potential conflict of interest talk with the inevitableness that comes with Roger Pensky owning the Speedway and the series and yet has a competing team. It's not even that. It's the fact that there might be some inside knowledge that Pensky knew about this and yet did it anyway. And we don't know yet, as we record this on April 24th, how deep the rabbit hole goes here. That's what concerns me. So I'm not getting mad at IndyCar. I'm getting mad at the fact that Penske might have been cheating, and long before this, and might have got rather than oh well, a motorsport team cheated. Oh, it's the nature of the sport. Everybody cheats. Yeah, we know that. It's not about that. It's about the fact that they might have gotten away with it for so long.
Yeah, most entities that cheat don't also own the series.
Yeah. It's again, like I said, it's a black mark for all involved. It's an ugly incident, and as you quite rightly said, Cam, I don't think we've heard the last of this just yet. It is bleak. The series needed some positive momentum. It's been a rough off season and a rough start to the year for them. And just when I thought they were going to get that with a genuinely really good Long Beach race, a really cool story driven race under fuel mileage. And now we've got a potential insider cheating scandal in a race that had 25% of its attendance watch from the track.
Trey,
yeah.
Remember all the good publicity for Penske's engine partner after St. Petersburg?
Well, yeah.
Well, okay, but Cam, remember what's behind the winning car now.
Yes, but that's exactly my point. The entity that wants to leave, their direct competitor appears to have been cheating. I'm sure that's going to make Honda want to stay. I'm really sure of that. God,
that's what we call in the business trade a push factor. That makes you push you towards the exit door.
Pushing me towards the edge.
Not good. Really, really not good.
We swear we like IndyCar on this show, but
we try. We try.
We're trying our best, guys. Come on.
I like it. Congratulations to Pato Award. I'm sure this will be a wonderful moment for everybody at Arrow McLaren to celebrate before they go on and unlawfully, unfairly terminate their fourth driver in the last 5 years.
Poor David Malukas, really. I mean, good God. I feel so sorry for that dude.
But you know who I don't feel sorry for is the Italian man who just scored a big bargain on Facebook buying a Kawasaki Ninja 250 for $1,000. I mean, Cam, you can't get a better deal than this. A Ninja 250 is like buying an MX-5. As a wise man once said, you buy it for $1,000, you sell it for exactly $1,000.
Yeah, I mean, basically cheap sport bikes, as long as you don't crash the thing, you put as many miles as you want on it, as long as you do the maintenance, you're not going to lose money.
Yeah, just rack them up.
Unfortunately, an entity that has been doing nothing but losing isn't going to get a chance to win all that much anymore ever again, because Kawasaki's leaving World Superbike.
Well, kind of. The iconic
As a factory. They're leaving
the
World Superbike.
Iconic Italian motorcycle manufacturer Bimota is set to return to the world stage in 2025, competing in the FIM World Superbike Championships. Also, the 2024 season may have just started. The big news surrounding the 25 season is Bimota will be back in the World Superbike grid. They'll be partnering with Kawasaki in a joint venture, which will result in a Bimota chassis with Kawasaki engine plus allied technology competing in the World Superbike. Not only were the donor Ninja ZX 10RR power plant feet familiar, but many of the team staff as Kawasaki transfers its efforts into the Bimota racing program, marking a landmark moment in the journey of the Kawasaki racing team after nearly 4 decades in the premier global racing series based on production machines that can be purchased at dealerships. Fun fact, a 49% stake in Bimota shares were recently purchased by Kawasaki. So, am I getting big, like, Renault rebrands to Alpine energy off of this?
I don't think it's that, and Cam can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the impression that I get here is that this is, I think, Kawasaki trying to flaunt their own resources to essentially sell or race with a bespoke homologation special. Because, add some context to this. Gone are the old days where you could buy a ridiculously powerful superbike for like $8,000. I remember I grew up in the time of like early 2000s where you could buy a Suzuki GSXR 1000 for like $7,000, and that was a 170 brake horsepower bike that could do 180 miles an hour. It was the best value for money deal you could buy on the road. Those days are dead. These days, superbikes are going for 40,000, and no one is buying them anymore because who in their right mind is spending 40 grand on a 200 mile an hour death trap with 220 horsepower and riding it on bumpy roads?
No, it's a typical 2-car and bicycle household. You know, you've got the Genesis GV80 on one side of the garage. You got yourself a nice Corvette C8 on the other side, and then you got yourself a $40,000 superbike. Who doesn't have one of these?
What has been happening over the last few years in World Superbike, for those who are not so inclined, as it is literally impossible to watch in the United States? It's more or less devolved into late 90s GT1 at Le Mans, but on 2 wheels, where
it's so sick.
Almost every major leader bike now, the Triple R Fireblade, the current Kawasaki, the various flavors of the Ducati V4, and the BMW 1000, they're more racing bikes that you can stick a license plate on rather than a production bike that you take racing.
Okay, now hold on, Cam. I need to protest that because I've yet to see any World Superbikes popping sick wheelies and then flip off into the sunset.
Well, they can. It does happen. It's just not really the intended use.
Well, it wasn't the intended use for the Mercedes CLR.
No, definitely not.
But I mean, we've talked about it on our show, of course.
And this feels almost like, rather than Kawasaki building the bikes themselves, they're more or less just going to build the engine and do a little bit of technical support and have Bimota basically just build the chassis for them, build the rest of the car, and then supply them the power plant. Car being relative here, it's a motorcycle.
It's 50.1 to 49.9 stakeholders split between the Italian Motorcycle Investment SPA and Kawasaki NB Industries.
Yeah, well, I think what they're going to do is that now... Look, Bimota's now got a challenge here. They've got to now figure out a way of fitting a Kawasaki Ninja ZX-10 engine into one of its bespoke chassis and racing frames, and then sell 125 of them for a $40,000 price tag to 125 lucky punters to be able to race in 2025, because that's the rules. You've got to sell 125 of these for no more than $44,000 in order to actually be able to race next year. Yeah, so good luck, Bimota.
It's not quite like, late 90s GT1. You have to sell them too. You can't just build them and say, ta-da, the fuel tank is the trunk.
Yeah, no, you actually have to sell one of these. Now, don't get me wrong. Bimota is a very bespoke Italian brand, and there'll be a bunch of high-end motorcycle enthusiasts that will be all over this. But for me, I suspect Kawasaki couldn't do something like this themselves because no one would buy it. But Bimota is so specialized and so high-end as
it's a boutique motorcycle brand, effectively.
It's a boutique brand. They probably will sell 125 of these, knowing that it's going to be a Kawasaki racing superbike.
Purely off of investment and rarity power. They're going to have to if they want to race. But yeah, it feels half like Kawasaki taking a step back from the limelight and half gaming the regulations and seeing what they can get.
Because, look, it's a Kawasaki in all but name. It's going to be Bimota by Kawasaki Racing Team. I mean, come on. The name is literally on the marquee for next year. I think Kawasaki's been very clever. I think they can now use a second brand, generate some more hype and attention for itself, and they can still potentially go out there and win if this racing team in collaboration with Kawasaki, who do have a lot of resources. Let's not forget, they have won 7 out of the last 10 World Superbike titles. 6 with Jonathan Ray, and let's not forget Tom Sykes won 1 too. They are proven winners in World Superbikes. I think it's actually a very clever move if they can convince 125 punters to part with their checks on this. But it is still kind of sad to see Kawasaki gone as a factory team, even though they're not really going as a. It's a weird one.
Renault's still around. Renault's still around as Alpine, and look how great it's going for them.
God damn.
Yeah.
I actually think that every Formula One team should be nationalized to some degree. Just
that is the worst idea that you have ever had on this podcast, and I have been here for years.
And I'll tell you what, it would just. I think it would make things a lot more interesting. Not that I believe that like nationalizing a Formula One team would be terrible, but just I want to see how other teams deal with it. I want to see if another I want to see how far this rabbit hole goes down. But that's for another time. And that's been the gosh darn news.
A lot of news this week.
Golly. What?
RJ, what am I looking at?
Well, before I get into my presentation, we're going to be talking about old Fuji Speedway, but I feel like it's very important to talk about what a banked turn is. So what is a banked turn? It's a curve or corner which allows a vehicle to turn at a higher speed thanks to the forces, to centrifugal force and gravity acting upon it. The best example I can give you is if you ever watch like a NASCAR race at Bristol versus a NASCAR race at Martinsville. I mean, they're both similarly sized tracks, but because Bristol's corners are used to be banked up to 36 degrees, it's now less, but they were banked pretty high compared to Martinsville, which is basically flat. And the corner speeds at Bristol are much greater than at Martinsville. As we know them now, velodromes, the things used for cycling that kind of look like Bristol, but for bikes, those were the forerunner to today's high-speed ovals, and they began using these in the 19th century or so. What are some of your favorite memories of riding a bike down a velodrome?
I've never actually ridden a bike in a velodrome. It sounds terrifying to me. Like I watch track cycling and I've seen the Chris Hoys and the Jason Kennys of the world do this, and it looks like a terrifying sport where the moment you drop, you're going to break a collarbone and disintegrate into the ground.
Isn't that what's the best part about it?
Also true.
They have a race called the Madison, and it's basically the Bristol night race on bicycles.
It's tag team wrestling, but around the track site.
It's roller jam.
Yes,
dude,
that's exactly what it is. It's roller jam, but with bicycles. I've watched it. It terrifies me.
Well, what if you added engines to those bicycles?
Well, let me tell you. Then we get to the days of the 1910s, where board track racing was popular. Some geniuses figured out the bright idea, just like, hey, instead of like making a track out of like dirt and bricks and pavement like those suckers down there in Indianapolis, you could just build one out of wood. You could build one out of wood, and it'll be super fun, and everybody has a place to see all the action, and it's great.
Yeah, I mean, for those who actually don't know, Harley Davidson over in the United States actually had once upon a time a very rich racing history, and they really got their start on the board tracks. Bikes with no brakes, bikes that were effectively bicycle frames with atmospheric head V-twins bolted into them. You didn't have a way to stop. other than your feet. And generally speaking, those bikes could get well beyond 100 miles per hour, even with relatively low horsepower, before the advent of things like overhead valves and later on Harley Davidson's 8-valve engine, which was extraordinarily potent in the mid-20s.
Yeah, nowadays Harley Davidson isn't meant for performance. Nowadays Harley
Unless
Davidson,
you're on a bagger.
yeah, but that's the exception to the rule. You think a lot of like these dad cosplayers are out here just like rocking up for King of the Baggers.
No, ask my daddy as a street glide from 3 years ago.
They're walking, riding their bikes downtown so they can go pull up in the Mission Barbecue because they want to support good old-fashioned American businesses, but they don't feel like cooking. And so these board tracks, they are fast as shit. To put it into perspective, there's a place called Tacoma Speedway that was at one point faster than Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And I just want to let that set in that a track made out of wooden planks was at one point faster than the fastest oval in the world. These places were very difficult to maintain because they're made of wood. It's not so much the fact that like you could crash and like fall through the wooden boards. It's just like, if the weather turned terrible, those wooden planks would just rot out, right?
Yep.
And I guess it makes sense. It's just like, these boards would just put up new ones.
Yeah. And those boards would wear out. I mean, in 1921, one of Harley's racers actually averaged over 100 miles per hour during a race in Fresno, California.
In the 1910s?
In 1921. That was at the very end of their involvement in the factory board track setting. And wow. As we find out, the tracks cannot physically handle the speeds.
And neither can the competitors. In 1912, there's a rider by the name of Eddie Hasha, a.k.a. the Texas Cyclone, which is an incredible wrestling name, but unfortunately he and 4 spectators perished in an incident that led the New York Times, that wonderful, wonderful bastion of impartial journalism, to coin the phrase murder-dromes and led to small board tracks being outlawed in some states. Over the course of the board tracks heyday, we lost 4 former Indianapolis 500 winners: Ali Wilcox, Joy Boyer, Ray Keech, and Gaston Chevrolet. But not on motorcycles. They were driving cars. Yes, they were driving cars on these board tracks. And I just think, wouldn't these cars just fall through the boards?
Makes you think.
It just makes you think. So that is basically how high-banked ovals came to be in their outset. And then we decided we could do this better. We could pave these. I put together on this screen a selection of what I like to call my favorite racetracks with high bank corners. I think everybody knows on the top left what that one is. That's Monza. That is the historic banking at Monza that featured 2 30-degree bank corners forming an oval that was mostly used as part of a combined course with what is now the Monza Road Course. And also on the oval, they had a special event called the Race of Two Worlds, which, correct me if I'm wrong, that was the event where they tried to pit like the top stars of the USAC Championship Car Series against some of the top drivers from Grand Prix racing, and it went...
It was certainly one of the races of all time.
It was definitely one of... I mean, not the most like career-damaging race that's ever been held at the Monza Oval in hindsight, but...
Oh, good.
Not that great. But yeah, the Monza banking was also like dangerous as shit. 3 drivers, Giuseppe Campari, Bacon Borsaccini, and Stanislav Tchaikovsky, died in an accident at the South Curve during the 1933 Italian Grand Prix in an incident known as the Black Day of Monza. The banking was last used in professional racing in 1969.
Nice.
And has since been restored. A good job. Here's a treat for you. It's since been restored for exhibition events. Well, there are some other ones of note too, like up in the top right, we got Brooklands. That was actually like the first one It's an oval. It's this bean shaped thing with two
kind of this oblong, not quite oval, but kind of the birthplace of auto racing on a bespoke track.
It really is. It had no guardrails.
So what happens if you go up the banking and crash?
You just fly, and wherever the good Lord takes you is wherever you land, either on the current plane of existence that you're on or in some other plane of existence entirely. Who's to say? They raced at this from 1909 to 1939, and it was later used as an airfield. Actually, it was used as an airfield, and then later an aircraft production site for both World Wars, and was later used as an assembly plant for the Concorde.
And it's a museum now. One of the genuine big racing museums and spectacles and tourist venues for motorsport history in general. It's a very cool museum. I highly recommend you check it out.
How fast do you think the Concorde could go around that banking?
So fast it might take off.
Who's to say? We have on the bottom right, we have, I think one of our favorites is Avis.
Now, when we talk about banking,
you've not seen anything yet, because the Automobil Verkehrs- und Übungsstraße, the Automobile Traffic and Training Road, as it's
nailed it,
is a favorite sick fuck circuit of ours, which in original form was over 12 miles long, and by 1935, a good time in Germany, it has to be said, for
most people not like myself.
No,
not like myself.
Definitely not. But at least they got the banking up to 43 degrees, and like Brooklyn's, they said guardrails are for suckers, and here at Avis, we are not suckers.
Now, keep in mind as well, during those mid 1930s, what you had.
A second. Well, there's your caution. We'll be back after these messages.
Keep in mind, in those 1930s, running on this Avis track were cars that, in a golden age, certainly not in the political terms in Germany, but their state-sponsored Grand Prix program was pushing quantities of horsepower and car construction to heights that were not seen until decades after World War II. Cars that were pushing well north of 450, 500 horsepower. And basically sending them down a 12-mile road with 43-degree banking to help them along the corner at each end.
Yeah,
at one
absolutely.
end, I should say.
Yeah, at one end. And think about this. It could have been even longer than that.
It could have been, because the original intended Avis layout was how long, RJ?
Let me do them. I know it wasn't no damn 12 miles.
Excuse me?
No, it was longer. And when we talk about Avis, we're not talking about that stuff that was used like back in like the late 80s or something. We're looking at a track that was, golly, very, very long. Very, very long. Cam, how long was this track? I genuinely lost in my notes. I don't know how long this place was going to be.
I'm trying to find it myself.
We
can just strike this piece out.
No, we leave it in here. But I also like this one over on the bottom left. This is Siques Terramar. It's in Spain, and you probably know that as it was used on an episode of the Grand Tour. But it's notable for having goddamn 66-degree bank curves.
Normal. Now, keep in mind, that is 6 times the banking of Indianapolis Motor Speedway.
That's steep.
You can't walk to the top. I've saw it on the Grand Tour. You cannot. You have to climb to get to the top of that bank.
Okay, well, Jeremy Clarkson can't walk to the top of it because he's old.
And fat, yes, I'm well aware. No, but the Clarkson test is probably not the fairest, but even so, even a fit person is not walking up that thing.
You would be surprised to know that this track didn't have much of a history of like terrible accidents. It was actually years of dysfunctional management and turnover in ownership that caused the track to shut down.
I'm shocked, I say. Shocked.
No. Yeah, those are, but it proved that like you could make high banked corners out of things that aren't wood. Way back in the day. And then time passes. We have a little bit of a world war. And then in steps the good old USA to change everything you know about bank corners, everything you know about speed. Because in 1959, this drops.
Oh. Hello, old pal.
So what we're looking at now is Daytona International Speedway. Opened in 1959. 31-degree bank curves, 18-degree banks in the tri-oval. It's the host of the Daytona 500, the Firecracker 400, what is now the Rolex 24, and in its opening year, a pair of USAC Champ Car races that were never done again when Marshall Teague died trying to set a new closed course speed record, and George Amick was killed during the first race itself, leading to the rest of them being canceled. Yeah, Daytona Speedway was very, very fast back then. It was a modern marvel of engineering. And you can thank city engineer Charles Moneypenny for this. Charles Moneypenny had a problem on his hands. He needed to build a high-speed racetrack, the fastest track ever built. But how are you going to do that and make it like so that the pavement is smooth and steady to roll into? As I've found that the real struggle was paving those banks. So in order to keep the paving machines still and stable while they laid down the pavement, Moneypenny devised a way to hook them up to bulldozers on the top of the incline. Well, first they had to go like dig up all the dirt to go form like the basic shape of the banks themselves, right? And fun fact, all that dirt was formed into a lake that we now know as Lake Lloyd.
Big lake.
Big lake. Once they'd done digging up all that dirt, they hooked the bulldozers up to the paving machines. The bulldozers are on the top of the incline, and the paving machines just roll slowly along, pulling the paving machines along below to help keep the machines from slipping and sliding as they paved the bank. And this basically became like the standard technique that Moneypenny would patent for paving high banked ovals like Talladega, Charlotte, Atlanta, so on and so forth as time goes on.
Yeah, and one of the biggest reasons behind that is because of, as we mentioned earlier, the banking being so difficult to maintain when the tracks were wood. Well, tracks like Monza had other issue because the banking that actually is supported at Monza, it's supported by giant, basically steel beams, big stilts. And over time, those began to split. Some would sink into the soft soil. And the surface at the Monza banking eventually became so broken and uneven, it just began to fall apart. It just began to tear cars apart.
Just shit.
There were world record attempts run there in the 60s where teams were going through cars not because of the car's inherent reliability failing over time, but because they were just pounding the shock absorbers out of the chassis.
God damn.
God, I wish that was me. So, fun fact about all of this: Charles Bunnypenny did this all at the request of Bill France Sr., who, fun fact, in addition to being the founder of NASCAR and the man who got Daytona International Speedway started, was also the campaign manager for Alabama's staunch segregationist governor George Wallace during his unsuccessful bid to run for president in 1972, and had Curtis Turner and Tim Block, two of NASCAR's best drivers, banned from the sport for life for trying to form a drivers' union. Both were later overturned. Fun.
Fun. He was a stand-up guy, Bill France, and by stand-up I mean punched in the face when he tried to build another giant oval later on in his life.
Well, you know, he would have to spend 4 years in third grade to get himself an idiot's license.
That is, of course, the words of Smoking Unic, who ran the best damn garage in town. What a Chad. Now, while all that's going on, in Japan we got other stuff happening. So this is a picture of Tamagawa Speedway. This is if you can believe it, this is a 3/4 mile dirt oval along the Tama River in the city of Tamagawa, near Kawasaki. Funny how this all works out. Tamagawa Speedway was the home site of the National Automobile Racing Tournament. Held it 4 times from 1936 to 1938 until all gasoline in Japan had to be rationed under Hideki Tojo's military dictatorship following the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Indeed, Taiju Kobayashi, the vice president of the Tamagawa Speedway Society, the nonprofit organization which has cared for the circuit's legacy and the last remnants of the site, which, in fact, no longer stand where they're at because they've had to build an even stronger levee to keep the city from getting flooded. Kobayashi has told the Japan Times long ago that if not for the Sino-Japanese War and the subsequent outbreak of World War II, that the landscape of auto racing in Japan today might more closely resemble that of America, built around oval racing for events like NASCAR and IndyCar. But alas, we don't get that reality because, World War II puts a big damper on things. Now, it's a good crowd.
You could say that.
Yeah, you could say that. Although, back before all this happened, the crowds are good here. It's clear that there's interest, not from domestic automakers, especially to try and get results out of this event. It's fair to say. I mean, that's always the case in any other developing motorsport nation. I also want to share,
but this also, RJ, considering the time period, it wasn't just developing in terms of motorsport. The auto industry itself was very much, very fledgling at that time in Japan. Of the current players that we, some of us drive them. A lot of them didn't even have their current name and wouldn't for years. Some of them weren't even making cars.
There's a good story from the very first event when in 1936 there was a small Japanese manufacturer named Ota Jidosha that took a 1-2 finish on a 12-kilometer sprint race led by Yuichi Ota, the son of company founder Hiro Ota. And the way in which they won raised the ire of a man named Yoshisuke Aikawa, the president of the upstart Nissan Motor Corporation, who handed down a strict order for his cars to win the next event in October that year. And then they brought a supercharged twin cam engine Nissan that won the race thereafter. I also want to show you this picture. This is of a man who, of course, lives, but this 29-year-old driver just ate shit when his turbocharged Hamamatsu Ford rolled over and threw him out of his car. It resulted in injuries to his left eye, and his mechanic and younger brother hurt his back. This 29-year-old driver would only do one more race as driver before he retired from that.
Well, what was his name, RJ?
You might know him as Soichiro Honda. The founder of the Honda Motor Company.
He's doing jumping jacks in midair.
He is ghost riding this whip underneath the car. That's incredible.
As soon as I saw the name of the brother, and then him.
Oh my god.
Hey, fun fact about that Ota Jadosha story: they would be acquired by Nissan later on down the road. So when Nissan said that this will not stand after this tiny little fucking
It's like,
Oda
we will
Jadosha,
bury you. We will eat you.
we will consume you and your heritage, and then we'll do the same to Prince some 20 years down the road later. Uh,
They
but
kept
yeah,
receipts. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
yeah, they kept receipts.
Fair enough.
But that was basically a roundabout history of Tamagawa Speedway, the first and last pre-war permanent road oval constructed in Japan. And if things had gone along the path that they'd done, maybe Japanese motorsport doesn't look like it does now with Super GT and Super Formula. We'd have NASCAR Japan series. We'd have points races.
Drift King and the STP Carbon every week.
Yes, potentially.
Hi, I'm RJ. This is a commercial for the podcast you're already listening to, and we'll make it brief. We have this thing called Patreon where if you give us $5 a month, we give you racing podcast episodes early. Although sometimes it's a little inconsistent, but we're trying our best, okay? Times are tough. We work a lot of jobs on the side. It happens. Now, if you really like us, you can give us $10 a month, and you can chat shit with us as these shows are being recorded, covering a wide range of topics, including cars, bikes, and cars with bikes on them. The money we raise on Patreon goes to making sure that the only ad you hear on this podcast is the one you're listening to now. That's something to consider if you have $5 a month to spare. Join us at patreon.com/motorsport101. Do it if you want, or don't. It's your decision, and we respect it. Back to the show.
I think it's time. It's time. Also, we talk about what happens after the war, because racing in Japan is mostly done on motorcycles. There, a lot of the first great Japanese racing car drivers actually got their start riding on motorcycles and motocross. And there is an event called the Mount Aso Road Race, which is basically like the Japanese equivalent to Isle of Man. It's run around public roads around the Aso volcano, which, as far as I know, never erupted during a race, although that would be kind of cool, although it would be also very dangerous.
Oh, yeah. It'd be like doing a race in the middle of a Tekken game.
It'd be like doing a middle of race in the middle of the 2008 film Speed Racer.
Good film. Great film.
But remember that Soichiro Honda guy who also went on to go start his own motorcycle company? Well, it turns out he also wanted to build his own racetrack. And led by Soichiro Honda, modern motor racing returned to Japan following the construction of Suzuka Circuit in 1962. The 5.8 kilometer figure eight held the first Japanese Grand Prix in 1963, which was not a single event of Formula car races, but a collection of touring car and sports car races that mostly featured. Okay, so the main event was usually like an invitation event where they would pull in drivers from outside Japan to go compete. Like Peter War, the former principal of Team Lotus, he won the first Japanese Grand Prix invitation event in a Lotus 23. Mike Knight was one of those drivers that competed. Fritz Huschke von Honstein, who was one of the main architects of Porsche's racing success in the 1960s, he also came to that. But on the undercard, you also had a lot of races that were mostly domestic cars driven by domestic Japanese drivers, and a lot of them really didn't have much of a racing background before the 1963 event, when they basically got a 2-week crash course on here's how to drive a car fast, and here is proper racing etiquette. Have fun. The Grand Prix is in 2 weeks.
Don't do the things that make you look bad.
What's the number one rule of racing etiquette, folks? Some good stories come out of that too, like in 1963 when Genichiro Tanada goes on to win the race in his Datsun Fairlady in 1963 against a number of foreign-made cars. And in 1964, we get the birth of the Skyline, where Tetsuya Kazawa and Yoshikazu Tsuneko tag team to try as hard as they can to beat the Porsche Carrera 4 of Sokichi Shikiba, a car that may have been imported from Japan, imported to Japan, I should say, from Porsche by Toyota to try and get one over on Prince Motor Company at the time, was the company making the Skyline. And that, of course, would now be part of the Nissan Heritage. But the fact that Skyline was able to, like, even lead a lap of the race against what is basically a purpose-built race car was a big moment.
Yeah. Because at that point, what you begin to see bleed over is increasingly top-shelf prototypes. And the 904 was not, over in Europe. It was a very competitive car in the lower classes, but it was a 2-liter car fundamentally. But for the first in a lineage that would eventually end up in Porsche more or less taking over both sides of the Atlantic, eventually with the 917, which will come in a bit later. But that's where those things began, and you begin to step away from domestic cars and begin to go closer to something like the full-blooded prototypes running in Europe.
I'd like to point out that this Porsche 904 was getting its ass worked by a crummy little 4-door sedan making about 150 horsepower. Okay.
To be fair, the 904 is about 180.
It's not so different.
Not so different.
I guess the larger point is
it was just really light.
These were still the cars in the 1960s in Japan. Not a lot of them were built for performance. And you know who that didn't sit well with? That's right, Ichiro Kono. His reputation and the post-war cabinet of Japanese government was that he was a strong man of Kanagawa Prefecture. He had such a powerful influence over his home prefecture to the extent that they nicknamed Kanagawa Kono Kingdom. He had a lot of different positions of power, despite multiple different power struggles within during his career. He helped establish Japan's Liberal Party, parentheses, you may be surprised here, it's not very liberal, but merged into the Democratic Party, which formed in today's LDP, which is how we got, the stuff that we have now in Japan. But for all the things that he was, and he also oversaw like the 1964 Tokyo Olympic Committee, for the purpose of this exercise, from 1964 until 1964, when he takes over said Olympic Committee, he's the Minister of Construction in Japan. He's basically Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
I thought you were going to say he wanted 350 for the Seattle Mariners, but no, you went there instead.
No, this is not a man that's hitting 350 for. No, this man is like batting 240 with like 35 home runs and 200 strikeouts with that build.
He's hitting dingers. I see. Just
that's a Jay Buhner. That's a Dave Kingman type.
Oh yeah.
That's Adam Dunn type stuff. But he's the Japanese Minister of Construction, this big man in his robe. He oversaw the construction of the Meishin Expressway, the big superhighway system in Japan. That's like, hey, that's how we get like all the cars driving really fast around there. And Ichiro Kono looked at Suzuka and like, this isn't going to work. We need something faster. We need something that's going to encourage our nation to build faster, more powerful, capable cars of competing against the world's best. He looked at Suzuka, this narrow little track with all of its twisty. He saw it as a bike track. He didn't see this as a car track.
Yes, keep in mind, this is 3 or 4 years before the advent of what you and I would call downforce. And Suzuka was really not all that quick of a track in period because you couldn't carry that much speed.
If you were lapping under 3 minutes around Suzuka back in these days, it was kind of a good thing. But luckily, there is a person that is willing to help us. But first, I need to bring him into this group of people right here. And I want to talk about this gentleman on the left. His name is Don Nichols. And if you're a Formula One fan of a certain vintage, you think, Don Nichols, this name sounds really fucking familiar. And it should, because he's the guy who founded Shadow Racing, the team that regularly punched above its weight in Formula One in the 1970s. That Shadow Racing, yes, which had its roots in Can-Am racing, building some of the craziest cars that championship had ever seen. Yes, that Shadow Racing.
The last champions of what would be considered original Can-Am after the oil crisis, because once the oil crisis hit, there was one more year, and that was it. And it was the tiny wheeled, massive winged Black Shadows developed under Don Nichols, who took home that last crown.
Don Nichols was a spy for the U.S. Army. He served in World War II in Korea. Not a lot of people knew about his dealings. He was often suspected of working for the CIA. But once his time in the military was done, he settled in Japan. He was a part-time racing driver. He did deals between Japan and the United States. And he was basically very essential in forming like the groundwork of the early years of Japanese motorsport. And he wanted to bring NASCAR racing to Japan. And so Nichols talked with some local Japanese businessmen, and they all got together and they formed Nippon NASCAR Corporation, a holding group that was established with the goal of building a 2.5-mile super speedway in Japan, basically identical to Daytona International Speedway. We're taking the Daytona experience and we're going international with it, baby, all around the world. First Japan, then who knows where else you can take this. You can take this to London. You can take it to Dubai. You can take it to Brazil. Damn, that's unfortunate.
Sorry, I don't have the soundboard in Riverside.
So Nichols chats up some people. He chats up Charles Moneypenny, this old-looking guy in the tie right here. He chats up Bill France Sr., and they all come together and they agree, well, if you want to build Daytona in Japan, by God, motherfucker, let's do it. And in June of 1964, after debating where they're going to build it in Japan, they decided they're going to build it at the foot of Mount Fuji. I've got this text clipping right here from a newspaper that says, Nippon NASCAR will start construction this month on a super speedway 70 miles southwest of Tokyo at the foot of Mount Fuji. It was announced yesterday following conferences between representatives of the sponsoring group, Japanese group, President Bill France of NASCAR. The race plant will be built on 980 acres of land acquired by Nippon NASCAR, organized this year to promote motorsports in Japan. At that time, France signed an agreement with the Japanese organization to provide technical assistance and cooperation. It is anticipated the top drivers of the U.S. NASCAR organization will be racing in Japan in 1965, and that members of the Japanese Association will be welcome to participate in events at Daytona International Speedway and other NASCAR-sanctioned races in the United States. Head of Nippon NASCAR is Nagahide Mori, board chairman of Marubeni Ida Co., one of Japan's largest corporations. The Japanese super speedway will be called Fuji International Speedway. It will have a 2.5 mile high banked oval similar to the Daytona track. Charles Money of Daytona Beach. Charles Moneypenny of Daytona Beach, I should say. Wow, I am so not good at talking fast. He engineered Daytona International Race Speedway, and he will go to Japan around June 20th to consult with Japanese engineers on the construction of the Fuji track. The completion of the race plant is expected next March, and the first race is scheduled for April or May.
Fuji Speedway mentioned. Roll credits.
And I just like to show off some of these like wonderful concept renders that have.
I just say if that's one on the top right, it would be to scale. Then forget Special Stage Route X.
Yeah, that's a whopper. It's a 15-mile oval.
Perspective wasn't really that much of a thing in the 1960s. They don't have all the latest. They don't have Photoshop. They don't have AI to cut corners on the work.
We're just gonna build the motherfucker directly at the base of a mountain, as you do.
But looking at the concept drawings and looking about how the layout was going to work, It is just that. It is Daytona
But Japan.
copy pasted over at the foot of Mount Fuji.
You just control X, you control X, control V at the base of a mountain. You tell some of the local residents, look, deal with the noise and harshness. We'll pay you a couple $1,000 to fuck off, and you can enjoy some racing. Now, I want to know what's going on with this road course right here, because this looks absolutely silly right here. And also, this is like different from the road course that they have on the top left render.
I say the top right and the top left look like similar road courses, which is to say they look like kind of a mess. And then this one in the bottom left here is entirely different.
I don't know if this is like, were they wanting to build like tunnels underneath the oval to do this?
Almost like Motegi.
Well, yeah, like underground tunnels, like other sports stadiums these days. You just go underneath. If you can't go up, you go under.
Okay, but while the concepts all look nice, these group of bozos went out there and they realized something absolutely horrible, and something that's actually very, very apparent when you even watch one corner of a race. You don't even have to watch a whole race. You can just watch.
I'm not even looking, RJ. I'm not even looking at the land. I'm looking at the picture of the render that they have. This land is not flat.
Yeah,
No.
This is something that these bozos all realize when they actually go out there to survey the land. The land that they picked out to build this track was not flat. And one key component about Daytona International Speedway of why it was such a marvel of engineering is that they picked a perfectly fucking flat cutting board piece of land to build this on, right next to an airfield. They didn't do any due diligence when they picked this joint out. And I'm sure that's what's going through all their faces, including flabby-chested Sir Sterling Moss. Yes, that's Sterling Moss coming over to consult on the project and tell all of them, quote, "It's a load of nonsense for you to build an oval track on this terrain."
That's extremely polite, even for the 1950s, to just call it nonsense.
Nowadays, he would have just told him, like, you're absolutely full of fucking shit.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
The people selling this land said, "No lowballers, I know what I have." And then they didn't go out in person before they put the money down.
That's what they're all thinking. Don Nichols is just looking at this like, well, we are in a shit pickle. Charles Moneypenny is just like, how is this going to work? And what's his face? Ida-san back there standing behind Moss and Nichols is just like, oh, geez, how long do I have before I inevitably get replaced on the board of this company? As it turns out, it doesn't take long. This is Ichiro Kono's son, Yohei. He takes over from Nagahide Mori to take the lead in practical matters and construction of Nippon NASCAR Fuji Speedway. But by February of 1965, 1 month after Yohei Kono takes the job, Nippon NASCAR and NASCAR reached an agreement to basically break things off. Kono the Younger was unhappy with the high contract fee with working with NASCAR. He wasn't happy with their style of management. And NASCAR is just like, no, we agree with that. Also, we believe that, building Daytona at the piece of land that you picked out is just absolutely ridiculous. In a mountainous, rainy region.
What's wrong with building an oval where it rains constantly and it's not flat?
Nippon NASCAR changed its name to Fuji International Speedway Company. They hire Taisei Corporation, the super contractor that had built the Ginza subway line in Tokyo, the terminal at Haneda Airport, and the Tokyo National Stadium, the first one. They hire them to build a road course based on the ideas of Sterling Moss, who told them, you can't build an oval here. Please build a road course instead. But it was decided in construction that as a nod to what this could have been, they would build one high bank corner as a remnant of the original proposal. And after some hemming and hawing between the construction company and Moneypenny and everybody involved, they decided to make it a 30-degree bank corner. Now, Cam, you mentioned there are problems of building a piece of track like this on land like this in this climate. There were indeed many problems. First problem, building the bank corner in the mountainous terrain resulted in a curve that went downhill as you went into the banking, as opposed to every other circuit with a bank corner that we've talked about. Avis, Brooklands, Seacrest Terramar, Avis, Daytona. Every other turn you climb into the banking. Here you drop
And you
into
go
it
up.
like a toboggan run. That's problem number one. Problem number two. Taisei Construction's road paving company would use the Moneypenny concept. They would attempt to construct a corner in the same way Moneypenny did at Daytona, anchoring the pavement machines to bulldozers that would drive slowly up top and allow the pavement machines to do their thing without slipping off. But that's really hard to do with the flat piece of land, and doing so on the mountainous terrain. Taisei Road accidentally created progressive banking.
Oh.
The problem is that they did it by paving the road so terribly that there's these three harsh, very visible seams. I blew up this picture from like the 1960s. You can see
you can see it on this not very good 1960s picture that there's effectively three track surfaces all occupying the same piece of road.
Now, you might be thinking, progressive banking, when you use that in NASCAR, that usually creates multiple lines of racing. So that's surely what happened. Nope, it turned this into a one-groove corner that made the inside completely useless.
Oh, good. Best laid plans and all that, yeah?
Yes. Everything's going
not
great.
quite as well laid pavement.
Yes, those road rollers were doing a lot of heavy lifting. Like they were just like tethered via like steel cables that like bless them. They were trying their best. Number three, because of the mountainous terrain, there's a giant bump in the middle of the corner. It is known as the horseback or umanose. Every time you drove over it, it unsettled the car. Overtaking was only possible once you passed this portion and reached the bottom of the hill in the ensuing right-hand sweeper, which formed the first part of the S curve that would go right back onto what is now currently the Fuji Speedway course. But yeah, there's this giant bump in the middle of the road, and it basically means you can't overtake until you pass it.
Well, you know, this surface and the bumps, they must take a hell of a toll on the cars.
Yep. Problem number four. All this undulation meant the cars, if they came to Japan, the race here had to have reinforced floors and stiffer suspension to prevent bottoming out through the corner. There's a story in this in the 1967 Grand Prix where Pete Brock, designer of the Corvette, not the Australian racing driver, brought his design, the Hino Samurai, over to Japan. But before they could qualify, the car was disqualified because the oil pan didn't meet minimum ground clearance. And a lot of people believe that's like a made-up excuse to like throw the team out because Toyota didn't want a subsidiary company embarrassing them. But I honestly believe that, because if the oil pan's scraping the bottom before the car even runs a lap and anger around this track, imagine what this is going to do to it when it actually runs at full tilt. So you have a bumpy track, right, with pavement that's not very good, and alongside here, you have the guardrail, basically ripped off the highways, and it had poor foundation. They told racer Kenjiro Tanaka during an event that there were no stakes driven into the foundation of the guardrails, which meant the cars could more easily break through it and fly off course.
So where's the good news come in here? Because you've just listed off like 5 problems with this thing in the last 5 minutes.
I've got two more.
Oh, good.
Yeah. No, problem number 6.
So 2 Vince Carter memes. Okay, cool.
I got 2 more in me. Number 6, there was also a crosswind that tended to blow across from right to left, which tended to make the car float through the corner.
All of this
Oh,
is at
no.
the end of a 1,600-meter home straight where drivers would approach the bank corner at full throttle and drop into it like a bobsleigh course.
That is not
Oh,
safe.
oh, and also out of all of this, Yohei Kono had to sell the Fuji Speedway holding company to Mitsubishi Estate because his father died suddenly. Ichiro Kono died in 1965, so Yohei Kono has to go in the family business of politics. And Yohei Kono actually turns out to be one of the more sane LDP members of Japan in recent times. You know, he actually like acknowledges like, you know, the fucked upness of comfort women during World War II, which I'm sure other people within the party did not like.
Did you just say comfort women?
Oh
Yes.
yeah, forced prostitution.
Oh, I had a feeling it was that. I almost didn't want the confirmation. Shit.
Well, yeah, that's something we talk about here. But yeah, that's that in a nutshell is how Fuji Speedway took a great idea and turned it into, well, I'm actually just going to show you a video, and we can actually just like cut once this makes it to YouTube or wherever we're posting this podcast of what happens when you get lucky.
What do you mean when you get lucky?
You'll see.
Around the oval. Down the middle. Oh no! Oh no! Great, it's another failed catch fence, and oh my god, that's a cliff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
you kind of get a feel for the unevenness of the terrain when almost every set of spectators here is on a different floor, effectively, of the earth.
Right.
So that is footage from the 1967 Japanese Grand Prix. By then, it is run exclusively by sports prototypes like the Porsche Carrera 6 and the Nissan R380 Mark II.
And what we had talked about earlier is, you know, as we begin to go through the 60s, you begin to see explosive growth in all forms of motorsport of car construction, aerodynamics, and horsepower.
Yeah.
And I mean, even from the car we talked about earlier, Carrera GTS to Carrera 6, the gain in horsepower was only about 20 to 30 horsepower.
Yeah.
That was also with significant aero improvements and taking hundreds of pounds out of the car by going from building the car like a road car to building a car out of thin steel tubes.
Yeah. So the crash that we watched was Tadashi Sakai chasing race leader Tetsuya Kizawa, an almost identical Porsche 906's Carrera 6's. Sakai's right rear tire gave out right over the horseback, which sent the car spinning off to the left, through and out of the banking, upside down into the protective catch fence, which doesn't look much better than the one that we watched in the clip from the Gosh Darn News earlier. Miraculously, Tadashi Sakai was stretchered out with only lacerations on his right-handed leg. And 3 weeks later, he'll go to a race at Funabashi Circuit near Chiba and win in his Shelby Daytona coupe. And it's kind of a miracle that he did, considering this could have been a lot worse.
I mean, once a car leaves the premises of the track, it's in the hands of the man upstairs.
Hey, good news for you, Cam. It's actually not much better if you stay within the track, because on March 29th, 1968, Team Toyota was testing their new 3-liter prototypes. One of their drivers, Yoshio Otsubo, was testing with his teammates when his car had a suspension failure. Caused his right front wheel to car off, his car lost control through the banking, and then tumbles down the banking. In a story, he recalled at that moment closing his eyes and thinking he would die. After his car came to a rest some 500 meters later, he's somehow unharmed. He rolled 500 meters down the inside of the bank.
I mean, RJ, when we talk about I mentioned the growth of performance here, we're talking mid-60s bias ply tires.
Yeah, those tires ain't shit. Like, you compare them
those
to
tires
radial
ain't
tires.
shit. And what you're beginning to see is exponential growth year on year of performance around this track. And the tires already had enough trouble handling this track and its layout before you began adding 50, 100 horsepower, 150 horsepower year on year. By the time that Toyota had arrived here, that was a 300 horsepower car.
Yeah. So we're talking about cars that are getting faster and faster incrementally. That's what happens when you get lucky around here at Fuji Speedway.
With the same tire technology.
Yeah, with the same tire technology, the suspension brakes tire, it's not all that much different. We're just adding more horsepower and taking more weight out. But Tadashi Sakai got lucky, and Yoshio Tsuba got lucky, but others didn't. It took only 2 race weekends for something to go even more catastrophically wrong. This is Kenichi Nagai. You're going to meet a few people along the journey of this podcast, and you're not going to see them for long, unfortunately. Kenichi Nagai, going into 1966, was the ace driver for the Isuzu Sports Car Club. Don't laugh. There was once a time where Isuzu made performance cars. He made his debut with the 1963 Japanese Grand Prix driving a Volkswagen Beetle, and by all accounts, pretty serviceable race driver. He is running in the 1966 Japan Grand Prix preliminary touring car race. He's running side by side, battling for position early on in the race when a small gust of wind sent the driver that was running alongside him in the direction of the guardrail and collected the guy in the process. While Gen Kobayashi, the other driver, bounced back into the track with the front tire puncture. The guy smashed the ill-constructed guardrail at around 180 kilometers per hour, flying 98 meters through the air and dropping 30 meters down on the side slopes of the banking upside down. The guy suffered fractures in both arms, both legs and shoulders, and a fracture in his upper spine. He died on his way to a nearby hospital at the age of 24. By the way, the Grand Prix was just in a few hours, and they decided at that point, after this accident, and word got out that Nagai had perished, that they just weren't going to try and contest positions through the banking. I think it's safe to say that that was smart.
A gentleman's agreement between racing drivers to not race one another through parts of this track.
It did. Yeah, it did ultimately. They did ultimately decide that you could race through that section with banking, but obviously it's a scary moment, and it wasn't even the first fatality that we'd had in Japanese motorsport. We did have a fatality in the first Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka, but this was the first moment where people realized hang on a minute, this track there needs to be some improvements made here. So that's when they do ultimately decide to add better catch fencing and try and reinforce that barrier off at the side where the guy's car just punched a hole through. But there's also another thing that's happening right around the same time. Remember when I mentioned that Ichiro Kono wanted cars to become faster and faster, and how Cam mentioned that all this technology is just building cars getting more powerful and powerful?
Well,
feast your eyes on this. This is a scene from the 1969 Japan Grand Prix.
Is that what I think it is?
Well, we'll talk about that car in the lower left for a bit, but I just want to talk about first this Nissan R382. This is a V12 powered car built to Group 7 regulations, the same regs that they have in Can-Am. You can build anything with 2 seats and 4 wheels on it. Everything else is fair game. Go as fast as you like. Pick a god and pray.
Yes, Group 7, kind of other than the late, it's more known for here, right? Can-Am. It's known for initially the domination of McLaren, and then eventually Porsche's twin-turbo 917s. And it's exactly as RJ put it. When people talk about how we should throw away all those modern rules and just let people build what they want, Group 7 is as close to something akin to Red Bull's X1. The crazy track day cars that get proposed every now and again. There were, in effect, no rules. 2 seats, fenders, 4 wheels. The rest is up to you. And where the initial growth of performance was chased by rules, just as it is in modern times with motorsport. You've got rules trying to peg these cars back year on year. There was no such thing in Group 7.
No, not at all. I mean, and you're also talking about an arms race between Toyota and Nissan, the two largest
Two companies with a blank check and a fuck the other guy attitude.
That's right. Nissan built the R3. Nissan purchased the R380 from Prince and developed them themselves. It inspired Toyota 7 to respond with the first Toyota 7, the 415S. Nissan responds with the R381, which is the funniest fucking thing I've ever seen. It's not in this photo, but it had a gigantic movable double rear wing that would stand up through corners and and lay down on the straights. It had a Chevy small block V8 because they couldn't finish their V12 in time. So what's the best way to get cheap, quick horsepower?
Drop a Chevy V8 in that
You're
thing.
damn right. USA!
USA!
Look, in a long enough timeline, everything gets an LS swap. But back in the 60s, on a long enough timeline, everything gets a small block Chevy swap. I know. My small block Chevy's sitting about 15 feet from me.
Damn, nice. But you know what happens when Nissan actually finishes that V12? It leads you to this, the R382. This is an almost perfect design. The V12 makes about 600 horsepower to counter the Toyota 474S, which is putting out about 500, 550. It is all-out competition between these two. Yes.
When I talked about explosive growth and performance, a year ago we were talking about a 300 horsepower Toyota 7.
Yeah, this car.
Now we're talking about a 550 horsepower Toyota 7, and that ain't the most powerful car here.
No, there's one that I intentionally left out because it's not part of like the Japanese domestic auto rate. But in addition to Toyota and Nissan having their own factory teams, there was a super privateer, Taki Racing Team, founded by former driver Shintaro Taki. He didn't have the resources to build his own cars, so he just bought the best that he could. He bought Lola's, and in 1969, he brought a fresh new Porsche 917. Now, I know what you're thinking. Porsche 917. That car won so much. It was perfect from the moment it was conceived.
Nope.
The Porsche 917 was an undrivable pig, and it was even worse in 1969 because of the way that it had to be reinforced for the rigors of this race.
Yes, the Porsche 917, which of course was Porsche's moonshot into their first Le Mans win, eventually dominating Can-Am. In its first year, well, when I talk about explosive performance growth, Porsche had effectively doubled their horsepower from the start of 1968 into the start of 1969. Nice. The most powerful Porsche racing car in 1968 to start the season made 270 horsepower. The 917, after exhaust revisions early in 1969, produced 580.
Yeah.
In the same general body design, which was built more for the previous Porsches and their underpowered engines, well, now the back of that car was lifting itself up at anything north of 200.
Yeah. Taki Racing Team hired Joe Siffert as a ringer, and he had trouble keeping this thing together.
There is footage of that car, and there's footage of Le Mans 1969, and Le Mans is even higher speed than this. Mm-hmm. And you watch the 917s who dominated that race until a gearbox failure in the 21st hour, and they're dancing all over the road. Yeah. I mean, Vic Elford, who drove here.
That's him in this.
That's him in this picture. I met that guy a few years ago. R.I.P. to an extraordinary multi-purpose racing driver.
Toyota hired Vic Elford as a ringer to try and help them develop their car because they were struggling at the time.
Yeah, and he was mortified by this place.
Yeah, he was mortified. Remember when I mentioned that you drop it in the banking? There's a famous quote on the Fuji Speedway Wikipedia page that is from Vic Elford that lays out the exact problems of why it's crazy to go race around here. Did you know that when Fuji Speedway had IndyCar and Can-Am invitational events where they would bring over the best drivers from the West to come over in exhibition races, they didn't run the banking?
Yeah. I'll read this quote off, or at least a piece of it, that in 1969, I spent 2 months in Japan doing a test contract for Toyota and their Toyota 7. Now, this is the 5-liter car. Not the one you'll know from Gran Turismo 4, as that came after this.
Yeah.
It was destined for Can-Am, but initially they ran it here. My last testing and then the subsequent sports car Grand Prix were at Fuji, but the track was run in a clockwise direction. The reason that banking was so horrific was that at the end of the straight, we went in over a blind crest at over 200 miles per hour and dropped into the banking.
Toboggan run. Bobsleigh.
Yeah, so these cars were growing. They had grown from 180 kilometers per hour to being able to clock well over 320. And then you jump a blind crest down into the corner.
This is the most dudes rock sort of thing in motorsport if you were to build it today.
It's something that cannot happen today. There's too many rules.
Mm-hmm.
And these cars didn't stop at 600 horsepower.
No. That's why I wanted to bring up the thing on the left. That's the Toyota 7. That's the car from the video game. It is conservatively rated
578A.
That's right. It conservatively is estimated at 800 horsepower. Team Toyota.
It made more. It made
more.
Much more.
It absolutely did. If you believe the words of the legendary Team Toyota lead driver Shihomi Hosoya, who we lost earlier this year at the age of 85, Shihomi Hosoya said that car was capable of putting out 1,000 horsepower.
Do you realize in the era of gamesmanship, even now, but even then, there, horsepower was rated whatever they wanted to say it was.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes to mess with insurance companies, sometimes to not give the game away to your competitors. When your propaganda number is 800 horsepower.
I'm sorry, what?
That's like the 276 horsepower of this class. And I want to reinforce again that the Toyota 7 Turbo, the 578A, was intended to go racing starting in 1970. In 1966, the Toyota 2000 GT raced around this event. It put out about 200 horsepower. So you're talking about
quadruple the horsepower.
Quadruple, almost quintupling the power output in things that are as big and as light as a shoebox.
Yes, the Toyota Turbo 7 realistically was producing well north of 1,000 horsepower. It also weighed about 620 kilograms.
I'll tell you, the cars, these other cars that look on the screen, not much heavier than that either.
Some of them are lighter. Some of them were lighter. I mean, the 917 that year was about 800 kilos and about 580 horsepower. That'll get you where you need to go in most places.
That's a bigger brake horsepower per ton than a Bugatti Veyron. That's
by a mile and a stretch.
That's north of 700 bhp per ton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the 7 was 1,000 on 620 kilos. The Nissan there, 600 horsepower and not many kilos. The naturally aspirated 7, same deal.
So, yes, these were to this style of racing by the late 60s. The Japan Grand Prix was basically the Indy 500, the Daytona 500, rolled in the one of Japanese national motorsport. This was a big deal. This was the one race that they wanted to win. Season-long championships did not matter. This is the one race you wanted to win. 1,000-kilometer endurance races did not matter. This is the race you wanted to win. And this practically was an endurance race by the time 1969 rolled around. But gas got expensive. Developing these cars got expensive. Nissan decided they wanted to stop. Toyota eventually had to decide that they must stop. Incredibly, apart from the guy's death in the preliminary events, no fatalities out of these sick automobile races.
Somehow.
And I suppose the only thing that kept these things on the ground was, mentioned earlier, the very birth of what we would term modern aerodynamic downforce. And, well, the tire technology isn't very good, but as long as you keep putting more tire in there, it might just make it grip.
Absolutely.
More rubber.
After Japanese motorsport kind of has to reform itself, we get to the early 70s, right? The Japan Grand Prix, as we know it, is no more. It's now a Formula Car race. Formula Car racing is just starting to take off with the JAF Grand Prix and the All Japan Formula 2000 Championship. And Fuji Speedway saw an opportunity to have like a proper drivers' championship, which was called the Fuji Grand Champion Series. Now, in 1971-72, it was kind of a run what you brung championship. And when I say run what you brung, I mean there were some old Can-Am cars that showed up. Better Porsche 917 showed up to race in it. But eventually, by about year 3, they get to a rule set. It's FIA Group 5 open-top prototypes with 2-liter engines producing about 300 horsepower. And you're thinking, all right, that is sane. That is a sane power output. You know, it's powerful, but it's not ridiculously powerful.
It's not 1,000 horsepower, but motorsport technology has not stopped in this time frame.
No, it hasn't.
You are still seeing exponential growth in aerodynamics, both in Formula One and in sports prototypes. And you're seeing tires begin to look a little bit more like the modern racing tires we have now. Wider, slick tires, eventually, a few years after this, leaving their bias ply construction behind.
Absolutely.
How fast were these little cars that weren't making all that much power?
Well, I'll tell you that, so I'm running the numbers up, but I'll tell you, they actually get faster. So by 1969, I've got it here that the pole time for the Japanese Grand Prix that was set by, I believe it was set by the legendary Kunimitsu Takahashi. In his Nissan R382. Can you tell I am so good at preparing notes for this? Like I got the hard parts done. That was easy. But then I just leave out all the easy shit. So yes. So back in qualifying for the 1969 Japan Grand Prix run, the same circuit, is another famous motorcycle racer that possessed 4 wheels, Moto Kitano. Moto Kitano was a factory MotoGP rider back in the early 60s. He was a race winner around Daytona in their motorcycle races, and he set pole with a time of 1 minute 44.470. That's not bad. Like, that's really, really not bad at all. Like, that's stupid quick.
Those are the fastest racing cars in the world at that time. Just on the back of sheer grunt and lightweight.
By the end of 1963, Motoharu Kurosawa, one of Kitano's Nissan teammates, you actually saw him in the yellow Nissan earlier. He set pole for the Fuji 200-kilometer Grand Champion race at 1 minute 42.81. So they gained almost 2 seconds.
So they have half the horsepower, and they're going 2 seconds a lap faster at a power track.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, it is ridiculous. And again, we're talking about a corner that is like borderline unsafe, that has already claimed lives, that has already had its share of serious accidents, and it becomes inevitable what happens next. This is Masaharu Nakano. He was born March 9th, 1949. He began racing at the age of 18, and by 1969, he became a member of the Toyota Motorsports Club, which was Toyota's sports club racing team. You work your way up to that. You eventually get your way up to the factory. He left Toyota Motorsports Club in 1971. He wanted to pursue a career as an independent driver with an inclination to race in Europe because, strangely enough, at that time, if you wanted to be a successful racing driver overseas, you had to break rank for the manufacturers. You had to go it alone as an independent. So he starts winning formula races, And in 1973, he gets a lucrative deal to sign Heroes Racing, which is a burgeoning super team in the Japanese scene founded by Hiroshi Tanaka. And in his first Fuji Grand Championship start in 1973, he finishes second. So clearly he has talent. And so we get to the Fuji Victory 200-kilometer race, the last race of the 1973 Grand Champion Series. We get to the opening lap, and on the opening lap, Tatsuya Ikazawa's car loses control through the banking and spins. Collects another car of Norimitsu Urushihara. Further on back, Nakano, running about 12th, checks up and spun across the track from the bottom to the top. That collects Masatomo Shimizu, Yasuhiro Okamoto, and Motokuni Tajima, and 2 others. Nakano's car, full of fuel, bursts into fire upon hitting the guardrail. The band of fire goes through the guardrails and the wire mesh as it rolls down the banking in flames. The circuit didn't have enough equipment to suppress the fire immediately, and Nakano burned to death while the race continued to its scheduled conclusion as if nothing had happened, because all the involved cars had ended up off the racing line, and the race was being broadcast on live television, and the organizers didn't want to leave the station with nothing to air. Masaharu Nakano was 24. He was 24 years old, man.
That's just the worst. That's nightmare fuel, and it sucks. Because, like, could you imagine if that happened today, where a race promotion or a race organizer said we wanted to appease the TV station by not stopping a race and potentially trying to save someone that was in the middle of a fatal accident? Just horrifying and heartbreaking.
Yeah, as it turns out, that's the same stuff that was happening out west was happening over here too. And it sucks because Nakano at that time was regarded as a talent. And the sick irony is he was not the first driver wearing a red crash helmet with sponsorship from the fashion company Edwards who lost his life in a terrible fiery accident. Because on February 12, 1969, Toyota Sachio Fukuzawa died in a private testing crash at Fukuroi, which kicked off a 12-year-long legal battle between Toyota and the surviving Fukuzawa family that was settled out of court.
Jesus Christ. A 12-year legal battle. How exhausting that must have been for all involved.
Absolutely. Okamoto actually has an account of the incident. He said, "All I could see in front of me was the Hewling gearbox and wide tires. Suddenly in the crowd of cars with only a few meters from the car in front, fire broke out. The car on my left suddenly burst into flames. Everyone else turned their steering wheel down to the right. I turned right too. And at that moment, a tremendous amount of gasoline rained down. And just when I started feeling hot, my hands were engulfed in flames. Like, there were multiple drivers that picked up a number of moderate to serious injuries out of this. And Nakano's crash was pretty terrible. And I think at that moment, it would have been reasonable to say, right, we have a course that we run for the international invitational races that's 4.3 kilometers long. We can shortcut the bank. We don't have to run that. We don't have to keep running races around this portion of the course. But they said, no, we're going to keep running around the banking. We're gonna keep this going. And all this is going on, by the way, at a time where there's an energy crisis going on in Japan. And this is front page news of a car burning to cinders. And all the prevailing thought was, what a waste of gasoline this is.
Yeah, it just sounds gluttonous.
I want you to meet a couple more people. On the left is Hiroshi Kazato. He was born March 13th, 1949. He made his racing debut in 1968, and quickly he becomes one of the more successful young drivers in Japan. He gets his first win in 1969. By 1970, he wins his first national title. By 1971, he makes his Can-Am Series debut in America, driving a Lola for Carl Haas. Finished a respectable 10th in points that year, which is astonishing. And then he used that momentum to go to Europe and make his Formula 2 debut in 1972, driving a semi-works March after being outbid by Niki Lauda for the works seat. Wonder what happened to him. Kazato was also a businessman. His family was well connected. He established a racing team, Nova Engineering, in 1973. And that year he becomes teammates to Tatsuya Ikazawa. He comes up a lot because he's the greatest driver of this era. at GRD International in 1973. Cazzato has a pretty solid second season in Formula 2. And he does well enough that in 1974, he signs a deal to join the Chevron Works team in Formula 2. He is basically the hottest young prospect from Japan with a real chance to break into Formula 1. On your right is Seiichi Suzuki. He has a different path. He started motorcycle racing in the 50s. He raced at Mount Asano. He became a Suzuki Works rider in 1960, and he raced a little bit of MotoGP's 50cc class, which is cute.
The baby
then
days.
He goes on to car racing in 1964, signs with Nissan in 65. He establishes his own company, Tomei Automobile, now Tomei Powered in 1968. And Suzuki also gets to race in America. So something does come out of the plans for the Japan NASCAR crossover, because Suzuki does get a chance to race in NASCAR. Not in Cup, but the Grand American Series, which is a lower level. It's like Busch, but it's like Xfinity, but if they only ran on road courses. And he ran a few of these races, and like even in Japan, he beat Daytona 500 champion Tiny Lund in a stock car race at Fuji in 1970. He was the guy who won his first race in the Fuji Grand Championship on the day that Masaharu Nakano was killed. That allowed him to finish fourth in that year's championship. And he finished second in the first round of the 1974 Grand Championship behind Masahiro Hasemi. Hiroshi Kasato would win Heat 1 of the 1974 Fuji Grand 300-kilometer race, which was a very contentious first heat, it has to be said. There was controversy over the starts. Some drivers were bickering about jump starts, and race control had to tell them, hey, make sure that this doesn't happen again for Heat 2. So we get to Heat 2. We get to the second lap of the race where Kunimitsu Takahashi is leading. And Motoharu Kurosawa and Moto Katano are battling wheel to wheel for second. The two of them make contact at least twice. Once I would say is enough to like send a message, but the other is just like completely inadvertently, because Katano on the left side has gone off into the grass, and that causes him to snap across the track, collecting other cars. He then goes between the cars of Kazato and Suzuki, tapping both on the left side. Now Katano's car veers all the way off to the right, collects Norimitsu Urashihara, who for the second time in 7 months is an unwilling passenger in a terrible crash at Fuji. His car mounts the top of Katano's. Katano's car is pinned under Urushihara's car as they veer off to the right. But miraculously, Urushihara is able to help Katano get out from underneath the car that's pinned on top of him just before the fuel tank explodes. Both drivers escape without serious injury. And if you were to just look at that, you would think, what a miracle. I'm glad nothing worse happened. Behind them, Hiroshi Kazato, who got clipped by Katano's car, spun off to the left, through an opening between the end of the main grandstand and the nearest guardrail, smashed head on the guardrail with enough force to rip the guardrail upwards because the first and second light posts had been driven into the body of the car itself. Kazato's mangled car took out a light post as it flew another 50 feet before coming to rest and erupting into flames. And then just seconds later, Suzuki's car hits straight on into the third post with enough force that it comes to a dead stop and explodes. Both drivers are killed. It's been 50 years since this accident, and it's still incredibly sad, because Suzuki was a respected veteran of the sport who is finally just starting to have real tangible success back home in Japan. And Kazato, I would say, very well could have made it to Formula One. I believe he had not only the talent, but the connections to make it happen. And in an instant, both of them were dead. The race is red flagged this time. It does not resume. There is actually a big fight between Moto Katano and Motoharu Kurosawa who set off the accident. And that leads to Kurosawa receiving a criminal investigation and an 18-month suspension on his license. because they felt he was liable for causing the accident to begin with. But ultimately, as the Japan Automobile Federation went through their investigation, they realized, these drivers are driving very, very recklessly. They want to make contact to cause entertainment for the fans. And this was the last straw on that. Kurosawa actually originally got a 5-year ban for this. He was lucky he got reduced down to 18 months.
Jeez.
And I think it's still debated to this day whether or not, because I don't think he caused it with ill intent. What I think this is that this was just a ticking time bomb that was always going to go off when you consider the way that drivers raced each other, when you consider how fast these cars were getting. And when you consider...
this was a track that, relative to other racetracks of the time, in an era where safety was not even third, safety wasn't considered at all more often than not. This track was in many ways not fit for purpose from day one. And then you get a decade of racing technology poured into these cars, and what barely flew a decade prior, with these cars going faster than ever, could no longer fly at all.
I mean, you've just shown a new picture now of it, RJ. I look at it now and I think, I can't believe they raced on that and they thought that was safe.
This is the last vestige of Daiichi Corner.
Yeah. So to wrap things up, obviously, after that awful crash on June 2nd, 1974, that claimed the lives of Hiroshi Kazato and Seiichi Suzuki, all racing at Fuji Speedway is suspended. And on July 30th, they decide to close the banking permanently. Every race thereafter would be held on the 4.3 kilometer shortcut course, which creates the hairpin that we now know today. Every iteration of Fuji Speedway has been developed off of the short course. It's changed over time. Of course, I think the most drastic renovation came when Toyota bought the circuit and commissioned Herman Tilke to modernize the place, because as it turns out, Fuji Speedway was still a very risky place to race. Drivers still suffered serious injuries. Drivers still lost their lives. Fumiyasu Sato and Toru Takahashi were killed in separate accidents between 1982 and 1983.
If you've played Gran Turismo 4 or Taurus Trophy, you know the old layouts of Fuji, and they, especially when you consider at that point, you're playing with ground effect cars, you're playing with Group C cars well north of 600 horsepower. It is a track where you can carry terrifying quantities of speed. Especially the 80s layout with no chicanes to break up the runs.
Yeah. No chicanes and flat out through the last corner followed by a 1 kilometer long straight. It's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And you play that course and you think, wow, how could it possibly get crazier than this? Well, it was much crazier for a time. Now, this is the 30-degree Bank Memorial Park. It is open to the public. You can walk there. You can visit the place. It stands there as a monument to every driver that raced around here from 1966 to 1974, back in these very brave, very silly, very reckless years. I hope to go there soon so I can walk along this banking, because I think, as terrible as a lot of this sounds, this is still a very important place of Japanese motoring history that I want to go see. And I'm also grateful that, yes, everybody hates the third sector of Fuji Speedway, but at the end of the day, the changes that it made over the years make sure that this place can stay racing for periods at a time, rain or shine. And I think we're all grateful for that. So what did we learn today, folks, through this?
Well,
don't try to drive race cars on what's effectively a double-sized bobsleigh run.
Don't buy land without surveying it first.
That's generally good advice for most walks of life.
Yeah.
That doesn't just have to be in motorsport context.
Yeah, many are saying. All right, now it's time for safety third.